No.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what I'm told is the penultimate tech talk of this afternoon. For those of you who've sat through them all, well done. For those of you who haven't, welcome, and where have you been? We are talking this afternoon about building resilient cities. We have put together an excellent panel of private sector, public sector, and NGO focus. We have Gerry from the city of San Jose, next to me, Paula from Willis Towers Watson, and Sama from the World Bank. So before we get started, perhaps we could go to each of you and ask you to introduce yourself, and then also say a little bit about what resilience in a civic environment means to you, because it's a broad-ranging topic. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Gerry, if we start with yourself.
Sure, thank you. So Gerry Driessen, Assistant CIO, City of San Jose, California. Been there 8 months. Prior to that, I came from Minnesota. I was with the County of Hennepin, which is the largest local government in Minnesota, for 19 years. So I've got 25 years of local government. I was 4 years as CIO in that county in Minnesota. So the topic of resilience. So the way I look at it is resilience is constantly evolving to meet the challenges brought to a city by the world and rising expectations, while at the same time maintaining diligence to be able to meet the basic needs that a city's charged with. And so day to day, you need to be able to provide police, fire, water treatment plant services, and then throw on top of that, you also need to be prepared for fires to break out in your state and PG&E shutting the power off. So constantly evolving, constantly keeping up with rising expectations, and always being prepared for the disaster that may hit you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Paula. Good to be here. Thanks, Ian, for the invitation. I am here representing Willis Towers Watson. We are a risk management, insurance, and asset management house. And we look at the perspective of resilience from a societal perspective, in the sense of how can we contribute from the asset management and insurance perspective. Our work is based, especially on the insurance side, on risk models. We look into how risks are going to evolve over time. We assign probabilities to the occurrences of these risks that affect society, and based on that, we develop solutions. So from the perspective of resilience and how can we contribute to more resilient cities, where our know-how comes in is how can we apply all the science behind the insurance risk models so that it can better inform decisions today, both on the risk management side, insurance for the private sector as well as the public sector, and how can that quantification and understanding of risks also inform investment in resilient infrastructure and other resilience programs that help cities confront the challenges of climate in particular.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sameh Wahba. I'm the Global Director for Urban Development, Disaster Risk Management, Resilience, and Land at the World Bank. Not really an NGO, Ian, but it's okay. I guess we're a multilateral development institution. We have a portfolio of about $30 billion of outstanding commitments in loans to cities, national governments related to these areas. So for me, a resilient city is very much, or the agenda of urban resilience is very much the ability of a city to basically identify the types of shocks and stresses and chronic stresses that it faces, and be able to adapt to these. And they involve two big dimensions. One dimension is the measurable types of shocks that they would face related to disaster risk, but also impacts of climate change, things that could be modeled, quantified, and therefore we can help the cities adapt to these. But also there are other types of shocks and stresses that faces them, including, for instance, social conflict. So I mean the challenge of a city in Jordan or in Lebanon when they have an influx of 100,000 refugees, overnight in the city, but also economic shocks and stresses. A city like, Detroit, faced shocks coming from a variety of other sources than, if you will, climate and impact. And our practice in urban resilience is growing. On average, over the past few years, we did about $3 billion annually of investment in strengthening the resilience of cities, including investments in flood protection, in basically weatherproofing infrastructure, climate-proofing infrastructure, and also strengthening their ability and capacity.
Thank you. And I want to pick up on two things that were mentioned in that introduction. The first one was around this concept of conceptualizing and understanding risk. So I think the best way that a city can truly start to be resilient is to understand the risks and the stresses that impact it. And that might sound like a very obvious thing to say, but one of the things that certainly from a MasterCard perspective we found is that cities don't necessarily know, at least in real time, what's happening in their environment. So how can cities better learn to understand the risks and the potential shocks that they face, and then not necessarily just mitigate for them, but lay it to a level of adaptation so that they can deal with those things when they inevitably come up? So Gerry, we'll start with yourself again.
All right, thanks, Ian. So I want to talk about 311, 911 because that is the center to what our citizens expect is how can I get service and who can I call to get the service? What we've conditioned our citizens is when there's something wrong, call 911. The problem with that is you're saturating a very finite resource, which are dispatchers, which are not highly paid positions. And in California, for sure, when you have a very high cost of living, it's hard to hire dispatchers. And this is a problem throughout the states, but in particular in Silicon Valley. So one of the ways you get to that bottom line of risk when you know that the longer your call wait time, you're talking about life and death issues. So if you've got calls coming in because somebody is discharging illegal fireworks and that's disrupting an actual domestic violence call or something more dangerous, you're talking life and death. So I'll talk a little bit about a partnership that we have with Google.org, where this is one of the advantages of Silicon Valley. We were able to work with Google. We have 6 of their staff that are actually working with us and dissecting the 1.2 million calls that we get, half of which we know are emergency calls to police and fire, but then there's another 300,000 that go to police and fire that are considered non-emergency. And so then you have to dissect that and say, how can we use artificial intelligence or some automation to serve our citizens without having them call 911. And so Google is working with us to help us figure out that problem and, quite frankly, retrain our public to say, you know what, 911 is there for you, but we have to use it for the right reasons.
Thank you. Well, from our perspective, we traditionally develop products, develop solutions. So most of the engagement approach that we have for engaging with cities is about trying to understand, okay, for example, in the case of 911, how are populations using it to respond to which risks that are being present, and then understanding the whole interaction among the different city agencies to truly understand from our perspective, if we see a city that is confronting earthquake risks or wildfire risks, how is that playing in the decision-making of all the city agencies? Are they connected or not? And same as most of our private sector organizations, cities are very complex organizations. And there's a lot of data that is housed at some agencies that other agencies could use as well, but maybe they're not necessarily communicating simply because the approach of how we use data hasn't taken place yet. The discussion hasn't taken place yet. So in our approach to understanding risks, we try to have that dialogue to enhance holistic risk management, which starts by understanding which risks are present, how are cities managing them, are we taking an overall holistic response, and how can we support then that understanding and future decision making with the data that we and our partners are bringing to the table. And the last thing I'm going to mention about that is that this is why it's so important that also from the private sector, as we develop solutions, we start by understanding what the true needs are and building from the bottom up, but also that we come together and create solutions that help cities use our services better.
Sama.
So on our end, understanding risk is the first step in the overall matrix of disaster risk management. You also have risk reduction, preparedness, risk finance and insurance, and then obviously post-disaster reconstruction and recovery. We, among other things, support a community of practice called Understanding Risk, in fact, that meets every 2 years. And it's a community that comprises of coders and public and private sector officials that meet every 2 years. It's about 10,000 strong. The next one is in Singapore in 2020. And they share innovation and advances on understanding risks, deployment of technology in trying to map and code risk. We use a lot of technology, to do things like flood mapping, landslide mapping. We use Earth observation. We have a partnership with the European Space Agency where we use the satellite data together with data from radars, etc., so that we can map risks as diverse as the subsidence of land in the city of Jakarta, landslide risk in the city of Rio de Janeiro, flooding risk in the city of Ulaanbaatar, for instance. We use that information, of course, to at the foundation of a hazard-informed or risk-informed land use planning, so that you can create, for instance, city expansion areas that are not, in those directions of floods or at risk, so that we don't exacerbate risk and vulnerability. And we also invest a lot in building capacity, including, for instance, in one of our projects in Tanzania, we did quite a bit of crowdsourcing with the community to try to create the first flood map of the city of Dar es Salaam. We trained university students and high school students in Zanzibar to deploy drones and to basically do all the transformation of the images in order to create the first flood maps and actually urban development maps, the first urban development maps of the islands of Zanzibar, so that you can map urban development, be able to figure out where flooding is occurring so that you can anticipate, you can address these types of challenges, and also use them as the foundation of service delivery. So there's a lot of investment that goes into understanding risk at the World Bank and underlies everything that we do after that.
Talks a little bit about risk. I think one of the points that is often becoming increasingly obvious to me is when we think about risk, naturally we think about large headline risk, earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, things that grab headlines that cause massive disruption, but in a relatively short period of time. And that tends to be what we focus on in terms of resilience. But if we think that resilience actually from a civic environment is about creating the best urban environment for the people who live and work in that environment, often resilience must go beyond that. It must encompass much slower moving things that affect people day to day. So how do we build a city that both deals and responds to those large headline, relatively infrequent, sometimes more frequent events, as well as the stuff that actually matters to people on a day-to-day basis? Traffic, homelessness, jobs, all the things that truly affect the livability of our urban environment.
I'll talk a little bit. I'm going to take it a little bit different direction. And first, you have to meet your citizens where they're at. And so San Jose, 10th largest city in the U.S., 1.1 or just over 1 million people. What isn't as well known is 40% of the population was not born in the U.S. 57% of the population speaks a language other than English in their home. And so if you start talking about how are you going to convey a message to that population to be resilient in an emergency situation or in a day-to-day operations situation, you talk about equity and you talk about providing services in their own natural language. Those are also considerations that come along. So you have to really understand the culture of your city and take a look at what your residents truly need.
Yeah. And how these slowly onsetting events are changing the dynamics of a city, right? So specifically looking into California, for example, we're looking into extreme heat. How is that affecting the health of workers, from construction workers to rural workers? What is the impact that the slow but surely increasing temperatures is having on population migration? Are people staying in the cities? Are people staying in the rural areas? Or are they going outside of certain existing centers? How will that then impact transport? So if we foresee what the evolution of temperatures are going to be in a certain city or region, we can start indeed planning for that population migration, not only from the perspective of where jobs are, how people are going to move between jobs and where they live, but also health, better health response to, for example, the impacts of extreme heat.
So I think that particular challenge for us is very much at the heart of city competitiveness. So First, we have mayors who come to us and say, please do help me make my city more resilient, because it is about business continuity. It's a core part of my ability to sell my city to investors, to firms to come and locate over here, is that when the next earthquake is going to happen, when the next flood is going to happen, there will be business continuity, or that we have attempted to minimize the impact on their operations. So that's quantifiable types of challenges that we could quantify, and we help the city strengthen. And then there's a whole other gamut of proper urban management and proper city management, service delivery, dealing with issues of homelessness, ensuring that you have a proper planning and delivery and financing of services that the city also needs to put in place in order not only to attract investors, but also to attract the footloose population, the talent that may want to choose to locate whether in one city or the other on the basis of the amenities and its ability to deliver services, the schooling, etc. So all these variables intersect when we're talking about the competitiveness of the city and the way it opens itself, it positions itself for attracting business firms and residents to come in there, and hence the intersection of all these forces in there. But at the same time, there are other things that are unquantifiable. Something like a conflict in your neighboring country and suddenly an influx of 100,000 people on your city. In certain cities in Lebanon, the city of Baalbek, just received overnight literally 100,000 Syrian refugees, and then how does the city cope with that? That's a different realm.
And I want to just pick up on this question of competitiveness, because cities do exist in a competitive environment. They compete for the best talent, the best services, the best overall experience for both the people who visit as well as the people who live there. But yet this question of resilience, this question of the threats that cities face from climate change, from a rapidly changing environment, are common to all. So how do you strike a balance as a city between that which is competitive advantage and that which you want to share? We're sitting at a forum today which is about cities and in civic environments coming together and sharing best practice. So how do you strike that line between sharing best practice while still maintaining the competitive elements associated to it? Because some of it has to be common. It's just good for all, but there still has to be an element of competitive advantage on the top. So Osama, we'll start with you from there.
So I think there are two sets of measures, if you want. There's structural measures which are very easy to put in place. They're costly. Putting in place flood protection infrastructure to reduce a problem of flooding. But then there are other dimensions out there, like a solid waste management dimension. If you're not collecting the garbage, it clogs the flood channels and therefore the city floods. If you don't manage urban development, urban expansion, if you don't control urban growth, there are encroachments on the floodplains that therefore exacerbate the problem of flooding. So there are institutional issues, policy issues, capacity issues, together with structural and non-structural interventions that all together make that compendium of investment. So for us to be able to, if you will, resolve this puzzle requires really an understanding of the types of challenges that face the city and trying to think very much about the types of win-win solutions that would help them both achieve competitiveness and address other challenges. So for instance, nature-based solutions, the ability to protect wetlands, to create both a space, an amenity for the city, a beautiful space, an environmentally friendly place that could enhance the value of the city as a place to live, could also be one of your best solutions for a flood protection. So here, the ability of finding the win-win type solutions that could achieve multiple goals becomes, if you want, the best way to learn from what other cities are doing, understand best practices, but adapt them to the need of your city for its competitiveness and its livability.
Yeah, and I would add that the decision-making and then implementation of those best practices has to be highly accompanied by a lot of communication with the people that live in those cities and in those regions. A very solid maybe indicator of the investment that cities are doing in becoming more resilient is how credit rating agencies are reflecting those investments by cities by actually either not allowing, showcasing that a certain city might be better prepared than another one, therefore maybe more competitive than another one in facing certain types of hurricanes. We're seeing that in the southern part of the US. Some cities are seeing their credit ratings affected quite negatively. For others, these credit agencies are noting that there has been key investments that are making that city more resilient. So that is a complete reflection of the investments that cities are doing in order to become or stay more competitive. And I think that making that communication clear is obviously a key component of showcasing that the city is competitive and is preparing and will improve. And what's really interesting is what you mentioned about nature-based solutions. We're starting to see a lot of combination as well of decision-making around not only gray infrastructure, the traditional cement-based infrastructure, but green infrastructure, and a combination of both. You mentioned wetlands, maybe wetlands together with a seawall, and how that can engage also local populations in building this and maintaining these resilience infrastructure projects. For example, wetlands have to be maintained over time, and that means more local jobs. Again, communicating that the city is investing in these topics, but it's inviting the population to stay and be part of it.
So we have our strategy in San Jose is three-pronged. So first, brilliant at the basics, then win our races, and then transform. And so everyone looks at, and our citizens too, it's always the innovation stuff. What are you doing to innovate more and more? Then power shutdown for 135,000 homes happens because of California fires, because of the heat problem and factors that are causing more fires in California. And then you start talking about where's all my fuel located to fuel all the generators? Do I have generators in all my fire stations that are powerful enough to open up the door to get the fire truck out? And so you start talking about if you are only in that innovation space and you neglect that basic investment and maintain what you need to do, because you can have everything electronic and automated. It doesn't work really well with the power off, right? So we're constantly looking at planning and working on the basics. The other thing I'll say is resilience is a skill set. So you have to practice this over and over again. And one of the outcomes, I kind of hate to say it because it was painful, but out of the power shutoffs that recently happened in California, we stood up our emergency operations center twice in like 4 weeks. We had only done it one other time for floods. That was last year. What it did for us was really made us analyze where our vulnerabilities were and how to pop up a call center to check in on homes with vulnerable populations that had that without power couldn't run electrical equipment. So you start to think about what you really need to pay attention to and start practicing that and drilling that in. That's also something that cities have to work on.
I want to just come back to a point, Paula, that you made about generating local jobs in wetlands and things, because I think this is possibly an example of a city generating resilience by creating resilience outside of the city, if you see what I mean. So I think one of the learnings that perhaps some of the more sophisticated cities are starting to understand is that people migrate to a city and put strain on a city because that's where the jobs are, that's where the work is, and they take people out of their local environment, which creates depopulation in the wider hinterland and creates undue stress on the city. So is there a role for a city to play to say, not just about creating resilience in its traditional urban environment, but also to help the populations that surround it and keep those populations in those locations so they don't feel the need to migrate into the city itself?
Certainly there's a role. I mean, the homelessness issue that I've talked about a couple times already, we've had an increase of 42% in our homeless population. And then you look at causality, and San Jose and the Silicon Valley is a very expensive place to live. The average, the median household price is $1 million. So you can't build enough. You can't create enough housing. So from a policy perspective and looking at resilience, and then providing services to populations that they don't have houses, they don't have an address, but you still have to account and take care of them in an emergency situation. So you have to start thinking in different ways and start to look at the causality. And you really have to look at the whole community, everyone in it. And you have to think about, what are we going to do about the disabled populations? What are we going to do about the homeless? And so you really need to be exhaustive. And that's why I said being resilient is a skill set and requires lots of practice and lots of thinking about all that goes into it.
And Paula, we've been working jointly with Willis to create financial products that encourage small-scale agricultural populations to remain in the fields and on the land. And I think this is part of that process.
Absolutely. As you were discussing right now, I was thinking that most of the work we've done so far, in my own experience and out of the reinsurance and insurance world, most of the work we've done around resilience has been about mitigation of risk, but ultimately adaptation by rural populations. There's always the possibility of migrating to cities, and cities are starting to truly feel the stress of a changing climate at this point and all its implications on every aspect of resilience. But on the rural sector, there's not that many options. And from working as we're doing with fisheries to agriculture in every location in the world, that is where true investments in innovation for resilience are making the key. And it doesn't have to be great breakthroughs. The biggest challenges are in the deployment of those solutions. And ultimately, that's what's going to allow populations to work in their own area. So as you were saying at the beginning, is it just the city? How does it connect with its environment? It's about that whole environmental view and understanding where risks originate, how the effects of each of them become cumulative and impact an entire region, and then tackling it from many different angles. There's not just one angle. And for that, we use innovation. We use a lot of data, which is a big part of the collaboration that MasterCard and Willis Towers Watson has, in order to understand how all these different factors are moving and changing and looking at an integrative approach to risk management.
So the majority of the cities that we work with are basically metropolitan areas that span beyond, if you will, the administrative boundaries and jurisdictions of a city. And the majority of the challenges that they face are transboundary. So for instance, a city like New Delhi has some of the worst air pollution in the world, but quite a bit of that problem emanates from outside of their boundaries. It's the agricultural farmers in the neighboring municipalities that burn the produce, that basically carries out Cairo, for instance. The traffic congestion in Cairo is very much caused by a neighboring jurisdiction that's issuing traffic, licenses for minibuses, etc., when Cairo itself stopped issuing these types of licenses. So that requires basically metropolitan coordination and the ability of mayors and local government officials to get together to create solutions that are integrated across jurisdictions. Now, again, when you look at cities and when they're trying to intervene on climate action, quite a bit of the areas of intervention might not be within their control. So, for instance, energy is one of the most important sectors that you may want to intervene in for resilience, for business continuity, to ensure that there are no blackouts or brownouts, etc. But power generation might be a national function. So again, the ability of a mayor to work vertically with other levels of government to create those systems that will enhance the resilience at the local level is also key. So as you rightly said, in a lot of the instances, cities will need to operate outside of their traditional jurisdictions in the form of partnerships for a mutual gain in order for them to be able to achieve the common collective goal of resilience or mitigation or otherwise.
Perfect. So we have 1 minute and 50 seconds left. I wanted to see if there's any questions from the audience, but please. I think we have a microphone as well. Or you can just shout.
I can shout.
Go for it.
I'll take the mic instead. So I really appreciate all the comments. There seems to me, from a resiliency perspective, that there's a sort of bottom line here. Being in New York, I've been able to survive various disasters like Hurricane Sandy and 9/11. And both of those have very similar outcomes or results of the disaster, which is it knocks out communication. I'm wondering, because I haven't heard yet anyway, when you talk about infrastructure, if you are including the broadband infrastructure of your cities, of the areas that you're covering, and how are you creating resiliency for your broadband? Because everything that you talked about, social, economic, governance, all those things, have one thing in common: they need to communicate. So we need to build resilient networks, and I'm curious if you could, even from a tech perspective, describe how you've approached that issue.
I'll take that. So resilient and redundant, I'll add that on as well. So San Jose is approaching that right now to build an additional network, Firstnet. So we're working with AT&T to be the first major city that has deployed Firstnet out to not just public safety, but also to public works, to essential partners as well. because what you find in an emergency situation, and certainly the two that you cited in New York, it's not just police and fire. It's public works. It's everybody who. It's all hands on deck really. And so providing FirstNet phones and then also the cradle points and the backbone for that redundant infrastructure is also how we're attempting to address that. I will say we're not all the way there yet, but we do appreciate your point, and that's our response at this point.
From our perspective, when we engage with cities and we try to understand the whole scope of the challenges they face and how to tackle it, the solutions we try to develop are those that will allow cities to tackle business interruption. Said differently, to allow for business continuity. And you're right, this is one of the key areas, having also been there for Sandy. And I would say that what cities need the most there is the ability to respond very quickly. So what we try to develop are solutions in terms of risk hedging or insurance that pay very quickly after an event, and that will allow cities to plan for it, knowing that there's going to be a payout from an insurance product that will allow them to have plans in place and quickly deploy. From the insurance perspective, that's how much we can support it. But if there's more ideas, happy to hear about them.
In a couple of words, I mean, connectivity and communication is necessary, but in my opinion, it's not sufficient. I mean, there's an entire spectrum that needs to operate together. You need to have a power infrastructure that functions. You need to have drills within the community so that everybody knows their role in the advent of a disaster. I mean, in Japan, they're doing constant drill with kids on how to evacuate buildings, how to cope if a tsunami comes, etc. Connectivity alone won't help. You need to have, you need to focus on the elderly, on the marginalized, on children, on, just about every segment of society, have them, prepared and ready. So I agree with you, communication is critical, but it's one of a compendium of things that allow you to be better prepared. And of course, quite a bit of investment in risk reduction as well, to the extent that that risk is measurable and you can anticipate it. And for instance, I mean, if you know that a certain area floods in the city, I mean, just don't issue building licenses in that thing, or do some preventive resettlement so that people whose house are likely to be flooded year in, year out could be living on a safer ground. That's all part of a comprehensive disaster risk management system.
Okay. So thank you. I think we need to leave it there. I think our time is up. I think we could have gone on a little longer. Paula and I will be holding a workshop just over there in the workshop area, the Tech Hub, get the right terminology. We were delighted if any of you'd like to join, where we're going to try and unpack this a little bit further. Other than that, I'd like to thank the panel. I think they've been great. Thank you for coming along and paying attention. And we'll be around to answer further questions.
Thank you.